Sometimes the quietest people hold the greatest worlds. Today, I'll tell you the story of a man who spent his entire life drawing cities he'd never visited. He knew the smells of streets he'd never seen, heard the noise of markets he'd never seen, and could describe bridges he'd never crossed. If you enjoy these quiet, forgotten stories, please like and subscribe. It helps these small lives not disappear amidst the noise. And now, let's open an old map and light a candle. Amsterdam, 1784. The morning arrives slowly, as if the city itself is reluctant to wake. The air is cool and a little damp, carrying the familiar scent of the canals, a mixture of river water, old wood, and distant smoke from bakeries that have already lit their fires. The light that filters through the narrow windows is pale and gentle, the kind that seems to hesitate before touching the floorboards. In this hour, before the streets fill with footsteps and wheels, the city feels suspended in a soft breath, like a held note waiting to settle. Along one of the quieter canals stands a narrow brick house with uneven shutters and a faded wooden door. The building leans slightly, the way many old houses do, as if tired from decades of enduring wind and rain. Above the small shop on the ground floor, a bookbinder's workshop that smells of glue and leather, lies a room with a single window overlooking the water. This room belongs to a man named Elias van der Meer, and every morning he wakes before the rest of the street, stepping carefully across the creaking planks so as not to disturb the silence that he treasures more than sleep itself. The city outside is still muted. A boatman pushes his skiff across the canal with slow, practiced strokes. His movement creates ripples that catch the early light, scattering it across the water in trembling lines. Somewhere far away, a church bell rings once. Not a call, not a signal, only a soft reminder that time continues its patient march. Elias pauses at the sound, listening with the same attention he gives to the faint whisper of ink drying on a parchment. Inside his room, everything seems touched by a thin layer of dust that glows warmly in the morning glow. The shelves against the wall hold rolled maps tied with string, some new and crisp, others yellowed and fraying at the edges. His desk, positioned near the window, bears the marks of years of use. Small burns from candle drippings, faint ink stains, scratches left by compass points. A glass bottle filled with dark ink rests beside a feather quill whose tip he sharpens every evening before bed. Nearby lies a stack of blank parchment sheets, the fibers slightly rough under the fingertips, perfect for drawing the lines and curves that form whole worlds. He opens the window a few inches, letting the breath of Amsterdam drift inside. The cold air brushes against his skin, carrying hints of coal, damp stone, and the faint sweetness of rising dough from a bakery 2 streets away. Elias closes his eyes for a moment, inhaling softly, as if the atmosphere itself is a story he must first read before beginning the day. For him, scents are like clues. They help him understand a place, even if that place is his own street. Later, when he hears someone describe the port of Marseille or the alleys of Edinburgh, he imagines their scents too: salt on stone, smoke in narrow passages, wet leaves trampled by hurried feet. The city slowly gains colour as the sun lifts behind the rooftops. Shadows fade, and silent silhouettes become people beginning their routines. A woman in a grey shawl sweeps the step of her house, her broom scraping softly. A milk cart rattles at the far end of the street, the cowbells on the harness chiming in irregular patterns. A merchant unlocks his shop door with a metallic click, that echoes faintly between the canal houses. Elias watches these moments from his window, not out of curiosity, but out of a quiet love for the unremarkable rhythm of life. To him, morning is the only time the city feels honest. Before voices rise, before markets bustle, before the hustle and calls drown out the small, meaningful noises. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the swoop of a bird landing on the edge of the roof, the soft knock of a boat against the wooden pier. These sounds paint a map of their own, one that Elias carries in his memory as carefully as any chart he draws. He lights a small oil lamp on his desk, its yellow flame flickering gently, though daylight is already claiming the room. The lamp serves more purpose than illumination. It creates a sense of warmth, of being enclosed within a safe circle that separates his work from the shifting world outside. He adjusts the wick until the flame steadies, then sets a sheet of parchment before him, smoothing its edges with deliberate touch. The quill waits nearby, its feathers slightly bent, like a bird resting before flight. Before starting his day's work, Elias performs a ritual he has kept for nearly 3 decades. He places his left hand lightly on the parchment, as if greeting an old friend, and whispers a few quiet words. Not a prayer, not a promise, simply a habit that grew from the loneliness of his craft. The room seems to settle with him, accepting his ritual as part of its own daily cycle. Outside, the canal mirrors the first real sunlight of the morning. The glow spreads across the water like melted gold, bending with the ripples until the reflection breaks into 100 tiny fragments. He observes this transformation with the fascination of someone who has spent years studying lines, curves, and shapes, trying to understand how something as fluid as light can take form even for a moment. His gaze lingers there, and for a heartbeat, he imagines he is somewhere else, perhaps looking at a harbour in a city he has never seen, where the water reflects different buildings and different skies. As the morning deepens, the city grows louder but not yet busy. Voices drift upward from the street, a greeting here, a laugh there, the clipped words of fishermen discussing the day's weather. Elias listens without focusing, absorbing only the texture of the sound, the way a musician might listen to distant melodies without needing to know the lyrics. These sounds anchor him, remind him that while he draws distant lands, he remains rooted in this one small corner of Amsterdam. He sits down, rolling his sleeves slightly to avoid smudging the ink. His fingers are slender and a little stiff from years of fine movements, but they still hold the quill with gentle precision. He dips it into the ink bottle, tapping the edge lightly to remove excess drops. The ink shines almost blue-black in the morning light, thick and smooth, a familiar comfort that never changes, even as the world beyond his window shifts with seasons and years. The first line he draws is always a simple one, a straight stroke from top to bottom, dividing the page, setting the foundation for whatever city he will work on today. That single line feels like breathing, steady, necessary, grounding. Outside, the day continues its slow unfolding. Inside, Elias marks the beginning of another world. And thus, the morning becomes not just a time of day, but a map of its own. Delicate, measured, filled with details that most people never notice. But he sees them. He listens. And in this quiet hour before the story of the day fully begins, the city offers him everything he needs to draw the places he has never walked. Elias van der Meer was a man shaped by quiet things. Ink stains on his fingertips, the soft grain of parchment beneath his palms, the faint tremor of a quill tracing out the outline of a distant shore. He had the appearance of someone who had spent most of his life indoors, under lamplight rather than sunlight. His shoulders were slightly rounded from years bent over maps, and his eyes carried the gentle tiredness of a person who had seen many worlds, but none of them with his own feet. At 52, he moved slowly, but with intention, each gesture careful, as though the air around him were fragile enough to break with sudden movement. His hair had once been a deeper brown, but had faded into a soft, uneven grey that matched the muted tones of his clothes. He dressed simply, in practical garments that had been patched in places, yet remained clean and orderly. He favoured wool coats and linen shirts, fabrics that held warmth during Amsterdam's long, damp seasons. His hands were thin, with small ink scars that no amount of washing ever entirely removed. When he smoothed a sheet of parchment or guided a compass across it, his fingers moved with a confidence that revealed their long-practiced familiarity with the craft. Elias lived alone in the room above the bookbinder's shop, and though he occasionally exchanged polite greetings with neighbours, he was a man more comfortable with silence than conversation. People in the street knew him in the way one knows a distant chimney or an old lamp-post, present, reliable, but rarely examined closely. Children sometimes pointed at him with curiosity, asking their parents why the man upstairs always had bits of paper stuck to his sleeves. Most adults answered with a shrug. "He draws maps," they would say, as if that explained everything. But even those who spoke of him rarely understood the truth. Elias was a cartographer who had never left his city. He had grown up near these same canals, the son of a modest clerk who kept ledgers for a shipping company. As a boy, Elias loved listening to sailors who came to the shop, men whose voices carried the scent of salt and wind. They spoke of storms in the Atlantic, of mountains that pierced the sky in lands he could not pronounce, of markets filled with spices that burned the tongue and colours that blinded the eye. While other boys dreamed of becoming sailors themselves, Elias dreamed of drawing the places these men described. His father once told him, half amused, that he had a mind made of lines and grids instead of dreams. But Elias did not see the difference. For him, lines were dreams, ways of giving shape to stories that would otherwise drift away like smoke. His father saved enough to buy him his first proper tools, a brass compass, a straight edge, and a small set of drafting pens with nibs so delicate they snapped if mishandled. Elias still kept those pens in a wooden box on the top shelf, long after they were too worn to use. He never opened the box anymore, but he also never moved it. Some objects stay not for their usefulness, but for the memory of hands that once held them. As he grew older, Elias's reputation developed quietly. Ship captains and merchants visited his small upstairs room with notebooks full of hurried sketches or verbal descriptions of harbours they had been to. They came because he had a talent for turning incomplete notes into orderly, beautiful maps. Maps that looked as if they had been drawn by someone who had stood on those distant hills and counted every tree, every stone, every shadow. He listened closely to the way a captain paused before describing a dangerous cove, or the way another's voice softened when speaking of a city that felt like home. Elias believed that emotions were as much a part of geography as mountains and rivers, and he tried to capture those feelings in the curves of his ink lines. Despite his skill and the small recognition it earned him, Elias never felt the urge to leave Amsterdam. Travel frightened him, not the idea of seeing new places, but the vast uncertainty of the world beyond his window. He had once been invited aboard a merchant ship as their official cartographer, but he refused. The sea churned in ways he did not understand, and waves seemed less dependable than the steady canal waters he had known since childhood. Instead, he convinced himself that he could know the world just as well from stories. If someone described a coastline with enough detail, if he listened deeply enough, perhaps that was a kind of travel too. His neighbours sometimes pitied him for his solitude, assuming that a man who worked alone must be lonely. But Elias did not experience loneliness in the way others did. His world was full of voices. Every map he made held the memory of the person who had described it. When he drew the crooked alleys of Lisbon, he heard the laughter of the sailor who had spoken of them. When he inked the steep steps of Genoa's harbour, he remembered how the merchant's hand trembled as he recalled the climb. His room might have looked empty to an outsider, but to Elias it held the breath of thousands of places. Still, he had moments when he wondered what it would be like to see even one of those cities with his own eyes. To walk through a market filled with unfamiliar smells, or to stand at the edge of a shore where the sea stretched into a horizon he could not draw. He imagined the wind in those places felt different, heavier near mountains, sharper on open plains, warmer in southern ports. Sometimes he pressed his palm against the cold glass of his window and imagined that beyond the canals lay a world larger than he could ever map. And yet, he always returned to his chair, to his desk, to the familiar creak of the floor and the quiet scratch of quill on parchment. He belonged to this room as much as the dust motes dancing in the light belonged to the air. People occasionally asked him how he could draw cities he had not seen. Elias answered with a small smile and said, "I listen." And he truly meant it. He listened not just to descriptions, but to pauses, hesitations, the way someone searched for the right word. He believed that every city had a rhythm, its own heartbeat, and that if he listened carefully to enough voices, he could feel that rhythm in his bones. His maps were not perfect in the strict academic sense. Scholars sometimes criticized them, pointing out inaccuracies in proportions or distances. But sailors loved them because his maps felt alive. They captured the essence of a place, its character, its soul. A scholar wanted precision, a traveller wanted recognition. And travellers found their memories reflected in Elias's lines. He never argued with those who critiqued his work. He simply nodded, accepted the comments, and continued drawing. Perfection was not his goal. Understanding was. In his small room above the bookbinder's shop, surrounded by rolled parchment and fading light, Elias van der Meer lived a life shaped by the world, yet rooted entirely in the narrow streets of Amsterdam. A man of quiet presence, gentle habits, and a gaze that always seemed fixed on some faraway landscape only he could see. Though he never stepped beyond his city's edge, the world had passed through his door again and again, leaving traces of itself in every line he ever drew. The room where Elias worked was small, but it carried a depth that larger spaces rarely held. It felt less like a place he lived in, and more like a chamber of memory, each object quietly holding its own gentle history. The walls were lined with shelves he had built himself years ago, crooked in places, uneven in others, but sturdy, like things made slowly and with care. The wood had darkened over time, absorbing lamp smoke, dust, and the faint scent of varnish. Some boards bowed slightly under the weight of countless rolled maps, tied with thin cords, their ends curling softly like tired leaves. The dominant feature of the room was the desk positioned beneath the single window. It was a heavy table made from oak, scarred by decades of use. Candle wax formed pale rivers along its edges, hardened into small frozen cascades. Ink blotches marked spots where his hand had slipped, or where a bottle had tipped ever so slightly. Each stain had its own shape: circles, splatters, thin trails, and Elias could recall the map he had been creating during many of those accidents. The desk, to him, was more than furniture. It was a witness to every coastline he had imagined, every river he had traced, every mountain range he had constructed from someone else's memories. Upon that desk lay the tools of his craft, arranged in a careful disorder that made sense only to him. His quills, some trimmed to fine points and others slightly worn, rested in a shallow bowl beside a small knife used for sharpening. A brass compass, its surface dulled from years of touch, sat near the edge, alongside a straight edge with one corner chipped. There was a porcelain inkwell, repaired once with a thin line of glue that had yellowed with age. Next to it lay a small cloth he used to wipe the excess ink from his nibs. The cloth, once white, was now a tapestry of grey-blue strokes that looked almost like a stormy sky. Stacks of parchment were arranged in uneven piles throughout the room, some untouched and crisp, others slightly curled, their fibres softened by time. A few sheets carried faint outlines from earlier attempts, half-finished maps abandoned when a sailor contradicted his own story, or when a new visitor offered better details. Elias never threw these failed sheets away. He tucked them under other parchments, keeping them like unfinished thoughts. They reminded him that maps, much like people, were rarely complete. On the wall beside his desk hung a small tin lantern. It was dented, its paint chipped off in places, but it cast a warm circle of light when lit. The flame inside flickered gently, reacting to the slightest draft from the window. Shadows moved across the room in slow waves, giving the illusion that the maps on the walls breathed. Elias often paused his work just to watch those shadows shift, fascinated by the way light could make still images seem alive. The floorboards under his feet were uneven and creaked whenever he stepped across them. Some planks sagged slightly, and he knew precisely where to place his weight to avoid a loud groan from the wood. Over the years, he had developed a silent path through the room, one that allowed him to move from desk to shelf to window without breaking the fragile calm that surrounded him. The sound of the floor had become familiar, almost friendly, and he found comfort in its predictable complaints. Near the window he had placed a small stool with a cushion that had long lost its softness. He used this spot to observe the canal outside, to watch the shifting weather or the slow drift of boats. Sometimes he brought a map to the window to examine how the natural light revealed imperfections in the ink. Morning light was the most honest. It showed every uneven stroke, every shaky curve. Evening light was kinder, turning errors into gentle shadows. Elias appreciated both types of truth. In one corner stood a modest cabinet with a lock that no longer worked. Inside, he kept his most treasured objects: letters from sailors who never returned, scraps of fabric from distant markets, a smooth stone from a foreign shore given to him by a friend long gone. There was even a small vial of sand, allegedly from a desert he could hardly imagine. He never showed these items to anyone. They were intimate proofs of his connection to the world beyond Amsterdam, tokens of places he had never walked, but felt he understood intimately. The air in the room carried a blend of scents that formed the quiet signature of his life. There was the persistent aroma of old paper, slightly sweet, slightly earthy. Mixed with it was the sharper smell of ink, metallic and heavy, especially when the bottle had just been opened. Faint traces of wax drifted from extinguished candles, mingling with the cool, damp breeze that slipped in from the canals. In winter, the room smelled of wool and dried herbs. He hung near the window to keep illness at bay. In summer, open shutters let in the scent of river water, warm stone, and marketplaces. The light in the room changed throughout the day, but it was always soft. Morning light was pale, diffused by mist from the canals. Afternoon light grew warmer, sliding across the parchment stacks and turning the rolled maps into golden cylinders. Even on grey days, and there were many, the room held a gentle luminosity, as if the white of the paper and the shimmer of ink absorbed what little brightness existed and returned it in quiet whispers. Every object in the room had its place, and yet the space never felt rigid or overly tidy. It felt lived in, shaped not by deliberate organization, but by the rhythm of someone who had spent his entire life doing one kind of work. The disorder was warm, familiar, almost comforting. It reflected who Elias was, a man who cared deeply about precision on paper, but allowed the world around him to drift into gentle disarray. His room was his harbour. The state of it told his story better than any diary could. It held his hours, his habits, his small corrections, his careful mistakes. It held the worlds he created and the one he inhabited. It was, in its quiet way, the truest map he ever drew. Elias began each day with a ritual so consistent that it seemed woven into the rhythm of the room itself. Before touching ink or parchment, before opening any of the rolled maps he had left unfinished the night before, he took a quiet moment to feel the shape of the morning around him. It was not superstition, nor habit without purpose. It was a way of aligning himself with the silence that made his work possible. He believed that a map drawn with a hurried mind would always bear the marks of that haste, no matter how precise the lines appeared. He rose from his narrow bed as soon as the first hint of grey light pressed through the window. The wooden floor was cold beneath his feet, the kind of cold that encouraged careful, deliberate movement. He walked slowly to the window and unlatched its iron hook with a soft click. When he pushed the window open a few inches, the air that slipped inside carried with it the smell of the canals, damp, mineral, and faintly sweet. He inhaled deeply, letting the coolness settle in his lungs. This breath always felt like the true beginning of the day, more than the sun or the bells or the sounds of distant carts. On the windowsill sat a small clay bowl filled with rainwater he collected for thinning his ink. The water glimmered faintly in the dim light, reflecting the blue of the early sky. Elias dipped 2 fingers into it, letting the cold water touch his skin, then brushed the moisture over his face. It woke him without aggression, a gentle reminder that time was moving again. He dried his hands on a cloth that hung beside the window, an old linen scrap softened by years of use. He then crossed the room to his desk. The lamp he had left burning low through the night had nearly exhausted its oil, and its flame flickered unsteadily. Elias cupped his hand around it, shielding it from the morning draught as he trimmed the wick with tiny scissors. When he relit it, the flames steadied, filling the room with its warm, amber glow. Though daylight would soon be bright enough to work by, he preferred the softness of lamplight. It held no sharp edges. It made his maps feel like old memories rather than tasks. On the corner of the desk lay a folded piece of parchment he had set aside the day before. He picked it up and examined the lines he had drawn, tentative outlines of a harbour in a far southern city. Though the map was unfinished, the early strokes already revealed his hand. The gentle curve of the coastline, the suggestion of crowded market streets behind it. He traced the lines with his fingertip, feeling the slight texture of dried ink. There was a comforting familiarity in the raised ridges, as though he could sense the memory of the moment he first drew them. Before sitting down, Elias took a fresh sheet of parchment from the stack. He held it up to the window, letting the pale morning light shine through it. He looked for imperfections, tiny dark specks, uneven fibers, slight warps from humidity. If a piece bore too many flaws, he returned it to the bottom of the stack. He believed that maps deserved good foundations, even if most of the world never noticed the difference. When he finally settled into his chair, he adjusted the cushion beneath him, smoothing the fabric with his palm. The chair creaked, its joints loosening further with every passing year, but its sound was a familiar companion. Elias placed the parchment on the desk, aligning its edges carefully, then reached for his quill. He inspected its tip, holding it close to the lamp to see where the light glinted off the sharpened nib. Satisfied, he dipped it into the inkwell with slow precision. The ink clung to the metal tip, forming a small, perfect bead. He tapped the quill softly against the edge of the inkwell, letting the excess ink fall back with a quiet drop. This tiny sound always seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the room held it with reverence. He then set the quill aside. He never began drawing immediately. The ink needed a moment to settle on the nib, to reach the consistency he preferred. Next came the step he cherished most, preparing his mind. Elias placed both hands flat on the desk, palms downward, and closed his eyes. He listened, not for anything specific, but for the shape of the silence, the distant creak of a boat against the pier, the faint calls of early workers in the street below, the soft whisper of the lamp flame shifting. These small sounds grounded him, reminded him that the world outside his window was alive and moving, even as he sat still. He opened his eyes slowly and allowed his gaze to rest on the blank parchment before him. A blank sheet was never empty to him. It was a quiet promise, a surface that held countless possible cities waiting to be coaxed into existence. He lightly touched the center of the page with one fingertip, as though greeting an old friend. He whispered a few words, soft, breath-like, unintelligible to anyone but himself. They were not prayers, but acknowledgments. It was his way of saying, "I am ready." Only then did he pick up the quill. The first stroke of every morning was deliberate and unhurried, a simple mark that did not yet belong to any city. Elias believed that beginning with a meaningless line freed him from the weight of expectation. It reminded him that maps grew gradually from small marks into detailed worlds. After that initial stroke, he lifted the quill, examining the ink's thickness, and nodded slightly to himself. Outside, the light grew stronger, creeping across the floorboards and climbing the legs of the desk. But Elias remained in the warm circle of the lamp, its glow steady and comforting. The day would come soon enough. For now, in this quiet hour, he lived in the delicate space between night and morning, where imagination and memory walked side by side. He bent over the parchment, quill poised, and let the day begin in ink. A visitor often arrived in the early hours, and that morning was no different. The knock on the door carried a familiar rhythm, a soft sequence Elias had learned to recognize long ago. It belonged to a sailor who returned to Amsterdam only a few times a year, bringing with him fragments of distant coastlines and the lingering scent of foreign winds. The man's presence always shifted the quiet balance of the room, not by volume, but by the weight of the world he carried on his clothes. When Elias opened the door, the hallway already hinted at the sailor's origin. The dampness of sea fog on worn fabric, the faint note of tar, the tired heaviness of someone who had spent weeks surrounded by waves instead of streets. The visitor stepped inside with the cautious respect of someone entering a fragile space. He removed his hat, brushed moisture from his coat, and waited for permission before moving farther. He carried a small bundle in his hands, wrapped in cloth, and placed it gently on the desk near the lamp. Inside were scattered pieces of his journey, a rough charcoal sketch of a southern harbour, hurried notes written on torn paper, measurements gathered with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and a few fragments of objects collected along the way. A metal clasp, a scrap of rope, a shell taken from a distant shore. These offerings were never grand, but they were sincere, shaped by the sailor's awareness that Elias valued even the smallest details. The man settled on the stool near the window, the fabric of his coat creasing quietly in the morning light. While warming his hands around a cup of water Elias had prepared, he began to recount the shape of his latest voyage. His words painted images of calm seas, glowing coastlines, and harbours reorganized since the previous year. He described fishermen moving across the water like shadows at dawn, warehouses built along new piers, and limestone quays that caught the sunlight so intensely they appeared almost white. The room absorbed the descriptions, and Elias listened with the concentration of someone accustomed to gathering stories one thread at a time. He paid attention not only to what was said, but to the pauses and the subtle shifts in tone, the signs that a memory held significance. The sailor spoke of markets thick with noise and scent, of twisting city streets that bent unpredictably, and of the warmth of southern air settling on the skin after weeks of cold open water. Elias observed the notes, turning each piece of paper with careful hands. The scribbles offered raw structure, but it was the spoken recollections that gave the cities their true shape. He examined the sketched harbour outline, the rough angle of a pier, the placement of a tower, then committed the imagery to his mind. He understood that these fragments, incomplete and imperfect, were the closest he would ever come to walking those distant streets. Among the items laid on the desk was a small shell, pale with a faint pink line across its curve. The sailor had carried it from a beach near one of the ports, keeping it safe despite storms and long nights on deck. Elias accepted it with quiet care. He traced the smooth edge with his thumb, absorbing the silent story it represented, a moment on a foreign shore, transferred across continents to his small, lamplit room. Once the visitor finished recounting his journey, the room fell into a shared stillness. Outside, a boat brushed against the canal's edge. Inside, the air held the soft weight of new information. The sailor rested, exhausted in a way only long travel could create, while Elias sat with the notes spread before him, already organizing them into the beginnings of a mental map. Eventually, the visitor rose, leaving behind the cloth bundle and its fragments of the world. His footsteps faded down the stairway, replaced by the faint creaking of the building settling back into its morning rhythm. Elias returned to his desk, the shells still in his hand, and understood that another city now lived in the room. Not one he had seen, but one carried to him piece by piece, through memory, scent, and sound. It was enough. The details the sailor left behind continued to settle in the quiet of the room, long after his footsteps had faded down the stairs. Elias allowed the silence to reclaim its natural shape, letting the remnants of the visitor's stories drift through his thoughts like soft currents. Once the morning regained its stillness, he began the part of his work that drew him most deeply into other worlds. The slow, attentive process of translating spoken memories into the beginnings of a map. He cleared a space on his desk, pushing aside older parchments with the same care one might give to fragile manuscripts. Every scrap left behind by the sailor held meaning, but words always did more than sketches. Elias relied on nuance, the tone with which a coastline was described, the hesitation before a certain detail, the consistency of a repeated memory. He gathered the scribbled notes into a loose pile and placed the charcoal sketch atop them. The rough drawing contained the seed of a city, but it was the narration of sounds and smells that gave the place dimension. He began by unfolding the torn sheet with the hastily written distances. The numbers were uneven, written during moments of uneasy travel, perhaps on a rocking deck or in the flicker of an oil lamp. Elias ran a finger along the list, recognizing patterns in the chaos. Sailors often remembered landmarks in relation to each other, rather than by precise measurement. The mind, he knew, did not record life as a series of exact proportions. It captured impressions. He had learned long ago that impressions often held more truth. Spreading the paper flat, he studied the notes until the scattered details started forming invisible lines in his thoughts. The distance between the stone quay and the market square, the mention of a narrow alley branching off from a street near the fish stalls, the account of the arch newly built at the water's edge, all these elements slowly aligned in his mind like stars settling into a constellation. He leaned back in his chair, allowing the imagery to form without forcing it. Cities revealed themselves gradually, piece by piece, just as stories do. He lifted the charcoal sketch next. The drawing was rough, almost childlike, but it carried the urgency of someone wanting to remember something before it slipped away. He examined the sloping lines that suggested the outline of the harbour. Though imprecise, the sketch captured the angle of approach from the sea, a detail the sailor likely hadn't realized he had given. Elias tilted the paper to catch different angles of light, noticing how the charcoal thickened in places where the memory must have felt more certain. Beside the sketch lay the small metal clasp and the coil of rope fragment. These physical remnants were objects the sailor had picked up almost without thinking, yet each piece contained information no words could convey. The clasp was cold, dense, and worn, indicating countless hands had touched it. It likely belonged to a merchant's chest, suggesting the presence of active trade. The rope fragment smelled faintly of brine and smoke, clues of a port city where fishermen and traders lived close to one another. Objects, Elias believed, were silent witnesses. They testified to places with a kind of honesty that stories could never fully capture. He placed the objects carefully aside and reached for the small seashell the sailor had offered. The delicate pink stripe running across its pale surface drew his eye immediately. The shell felt impossibly smooth, shaped by time and water in ways human hands could not replicate. He held it to his ear for a moment, a habit from childhood that had never left him. The faint echo inside reminded him of wind funneling through narrow alleys, or waves tapping against stone. Sounds he had never heard outside of stories, yet always felt familiar. With all the fragments gathered before him, Elias prepared his senses for the delicate task ahead. He did not simply begin drawing. The map first had to settle into his mind. He closed his eyes and allowed the sailor's descriptions to return. The bright limestone pier, the twisting alleys behind the harbour, the fishermen's nets glowing at dawn. He imagined the smell of roasted spices drifting from market stalls, the texture of weathered wood beneath the soles of sailors' boots, the sharp sting of sea air hitting warm skin after weeks enclosed in a cabin. He let these impressions build slowly, without rushing them. A map begun too quickly, he believed, was a map destined to feel empty. A city had to be felt before it was drawn. He listened again to the memory of the sailor's voice, the steady cadence when he spoke of familiar harbours, the subtle uncertainty when describing new constructions. Each shift in tone revealed the contours of knowledge and doubt. Elias relied on both. A perfect memory was rare, but a flawed one often brought out the essence of a place more clearly. Once he felt the city settling into coherence in his thoughts, he rearranged the notes into an order only he understood. He placed the scribbled description of the coastline at the top of the desk, aligned the charcoal sketch beside it, and placed the torn paper with street notes to the left. He touched each item lightly, committing their contents to memory. His hand paused on the shell again, its smooth curve grounding him in the reality that this distant place existed not only in words, but in the tangible world beyond Amsterdam. He then turned toward the blank parchment waiting on the desk. He did not pick up the quill yet. Instead, he focused on the faint texture of the paper, letting his fingers trace its surface. He understood that every city he recreated began not with ink, but with intention. He imagined the harbour from above, the movement of people along the shoreline, the angles of the streets branching inward. The details from the sailor's recollections aligned themselves into an invisible sketch layered beneath the blank sheet. Slowly, the mental map began to solidify. He envisioned the way sunlight would fall on the pale stone quay, how shadows would gather in the narrow passages between buildings. He pictured fishermen hauling nets, the boats brushing against one another in the rising tide, the curve of the city wall behind the marketplace. Every image settled into its place, quietly, patiently. Only after he felt the city breathe in his imagination did he reach for his quill. The work ahead would take hours, perhaps days. But in that moment, Elias recognized that the transformation had already begun. The distant harbour no longer existed solely in the memories of a single traveller. It now lived, however faintly, within the four walls of his small room, ready to be shaped into lines and curves that would one day guide others. The world outside his window remained unchanged, but inside his mind, another city had just opened its gates. Elias had always believed that the act of drawing a map was inseparable from the act of contemplating the limits of one's own life. Each stroke of ink carried both precision and longing, a tether between the world he inhabited and the countless worlds he would never touch. As he prepared to begin another long day of work, this awareness washed over him with a familiar calm. The city outside his window remained the same. Dim canals, quiet steps, the muted rhythm of a place that had shaped him since childhood. Yet the cities he recreated on paper were constantly shifting, expanding, breathing through stories brought to him by people who moved through them. He often wondered what it meant that he could know so much about lands he had never crossed. He thought about this as he leaned back slightly in his chair, letting the soft weight of morning settle around him. The air still carried the faint scent of canal water drifting through the half-open window. The noises of the street remained gentle, the occasional creak of a cartwheel, the distant call of someone sweeping their doorstep, the low murmur of a conversation drifting from a nearby shop. These sounds grounded him. They were the anchor to the life he knew, the life he understood intimately. Yet, even in these moments of domestic quiet, a small part of him drifted elsewhere, drawn toward horizons he had only ever imagined. Elias lifted the seashell again, holding it between his fingers. Its smooth surface caught the lamp's glow, reflecting a pale shimmer. The object felt impossibly light, a piece of a world that had traveled farther than he ever had. He found himself thinking about the place where it had been picked up, an unfamiliar beach, touched by warmer tides, shaped by winds that carried scents he would never breathe. He considered the shoreline, how the waves must have moved, how the sand felt beneath bare feet, how the sound of the sea might have swallowed the voices of people walking close to the water. It struck him that the shell knew the truth of that place better than he ever could, and yet he was the one tasked with recreating it. This contradiction did not trouble him. Instead, it intrigued him. There was a quiet philosophy in the idea that understanding did not require presence. Stories, when offered sincerely, held their own authenticity. The worlds he drew were not replicas of real places. They were interpretations, filtered through emotion, memory, and the imperfections inherent in human recollection. For some, this made them flawed. For Elias, it made them alive. He placed the shell down carefully and let his thoughts drift further. The room around him was filled with maps of lands he had never seen, each one the result of someone else's footsteps and someone else's eyes. He wondered what it must feel like to stand on the deck of a ship as it approached a foreign coast. The swell of the sea pushing forward, the distant line of rooftops emerging from the mist, the thrill of seeing something new. He imagined the salty spray on skin, the sound of gulls circling overhead, the weight of anticipation in a sailor's chest. It was a sensation he had never experienced, yet one he had painted hundreds of times in his mind. A quieter thought followed. Perhaps he feared that if he ever actually travelled, the world would disappoint him. The places he had imagined for decades carried a softness, an unbroken beauty shaped by the stories of others. Reality, with its harsh edges, its noise, its unpredictability, might fracture the fragile ideal he had nurtured. His cities existed in a delicate balance, constructed from impressions, refined by emotion, preserved in ink. To see them for himself might undo the magic that sustained his craft. Yet there were moments, private, fleeting, when Elias envied the travellers who came to him. They carried the ocean in the creases of their coats, the dust of distant roads in the folds of their clothes, and the glow of unfamiliar sunlight still lingering in their eyes. Their voices held echoes of other lands, other skies. He sometimes wondered what his own voice might sound like if it ever carried such echoes. Would it change? Would he? As he pondered, he became aware of the warmth of the lamp beside him. The flame flickered gently, casting soft shadows across the room. The light illuminated the edges of his rolled maps, turning the parchment slightly translucent, revealing faint silhouettes of drawings beneath. It reminded him that his world was built on layers, stories overlapping stories, memories woven into geographical shapes. He picked up one of the sailor's torn notes again. The hurried script described the streets behind the harbour, crooked pathways, uneven stone steps, homes stacked atop one another like haphazard towers. The writer had mentioned how the air smelled of spices and firewood, how children ran barefoot through alleys, laughing as they dodged fishermen carrying baskets. Elias imagined the noise of such a place, the arguments, the laughter, the calls of vendors selling goods from distant markets. He realized that although he had never walked those streets, he felt he understood their rhythm better than some who had. The idea that he could know a place through fragments alone brought him a sense of quiet contentment. Travel, he thought, was not only a physical act, it was a mental one. Through the voices of others, through their artifacts and recollections, he had travelled to countless harbours, mountain passes, and bustling markets. His journeys occurred not on open seas, but in the space between memory and imagination, and in some quiet way that felt enough. He rested his palms on the parchment, letting its cool surface steady him. The thought returned, gentle but persistent, that the world was far too vast for any single person to experience in its entirety. Perhaps his role was not to see everything firsthand, but to preserve the reflections of those who had. The task suited him. He was not a man built for roads and restless nights. He was built for silence, for patience, for the delicate interpretation of details that others overlooked. He lifted his gaze again, letting it settle on the window. Outside, the water shimmered faintly. The city was beginning to stir, but its movements remained muted. A boat drifted slowly along the canal, leaving a subtle wake that rippled outward in smooth waves. Elias watched the patterns spread across the surface and wondered how many places in the world had their own unique way of reflecting light on water. He imagined seas of deeper blue, rivers of red clay, lakes resting beneath mountain shadows. His thoughts circled back to the sailor who had visited earlier. The man had spoken with the weary conviction of someone who had seen too much and understood too little of it. His stories carried the weight of truth, but also the distortions of memory. Elias found beauty in those distortions. Human recollection, he believed, added its own geography, emotional landscapes overlaid upon physical ones. That was the geography he sought to capture. He folded the sailor's notes and placed them neatly beside the charcoal sketch. The room felt fuller now, not with objects, but with the subtle presence of a distant city. Its scents, sounds, and textures lingered invisibly, waiting to be transformed into ink. Elias felt a gentle resolve forming within him. Though he could not step beyond the boundaries of Amsterdam, he still held the ability to give shape to faraway places. His maps became vessels for the experiences of others. Through him, their journeys gained permanence. The thought calmed him. He no longer felt the tug of desire or the sting of envy. Instead, he felt the quiet satisfaction of purpose. The world might be unreachable by foot, but it was not unreachable by mind. He lowered his gaze to the parchment once more, seeing not the blank page, but the faint outline of a harbour forming in his imagination. Another city, another life, another small piece of a world he would never walk, yet knew intimately through stories alone. In that moment, he felt no distance between himself and the places he longed for. He lived among them, quietly, through the whispered journeys of those who passed through his door. The stack of unfinished maps stored in the corner of the room held remnants of years long past. Yet one set of pages stood apart from the rest, carefully wrapped in cloth, edges softened, the ink faded into a brownish grey. Elias reached for them with a slowness that suggested both reverence and hesitation. These maps belonged to a city that no longer existed, a place erased by fire decades ago. He had drawn it in his youth, guided by the recollections of old men who had lived there before its destruction. Their memories had been fragile even then, fractured by time, grief, and fear. Yet those fragments had been enough for him to construct a quiet echo of the vanished place. He unwrapped the bundle and spread the sheets across his desk. The parchment crackled softly, brittle with age. The lines, once sharp, now looked as though they had been softened by sorrow. Elias remembered the first time he worked on this map, sitting much as he sat now, though younger, with steadier hands and a mind filled with idealism. The men who had guided him through their stories had spoken with a weight that suggested they were not merely describing geography, but mourning an entire way of life. They had attempted to recall the angles of streets long gone, the position of a fountain that no longer flowed, the pattern of rooftops consumed by flames. He touched one of the faded lines gently. The street it represented had once been the bustling heart of the city, lined with merchants selling bread, fabric, tools, and spices. According to the men who had described it, a specific bakery stood at the corner, its windows always clouded with steam. The scent of freshly baked loaves had been inseparable from the memory of that street. Elias had drawn the bakery with tender accuracy, adding tiny details the men had recalled with trembling voices. The slanted roof tiles, the small wooden sign shaped like a wheat stalk, the uneven cobblestones just beyond the entrance. He lifted a different sheet, where the city's central square was sketched. The old men had spoken at length about this place, their memories weaving together like threads in a tapestry. They had described the stone well in the centre, worn smooth from generations of hands. Children had once played around it, families had gathered there during festivals, and travellers had rested beside it to drink cool water. Elias remembered the sorrow in the storytellers' voices when they explained how the well, like everything else, had been reduced to ash. On another sheet lay the outline of the city's outer walls. These walls had once protected the inhabitants from storms and invaders, though they had ultimately proven helpless against the fire that consumed the city. The storytellers had described the walls with a mixture of pride and bitterness, remembering how they had once seemed strong enough to outlast centuries. Elias had drawn them with careful strokes, believing at the time that the act of recording them was a way of granting them a second life. Revisiting these maps always stirred something complex within him. This city, though never visited, felt more intimately known to him than many places he had drawn since. Its entire existence had been transmitted through memory and grief, and every line on the parchment carried traces of that emotional weight. He could still recall the pauses in the old men's stories, the moments when they struggled to find the words to capture a place that no longer stood. Those silences had spoken louder than their descriptions. They had taught him that a map was not only a record of geography, but of absence, an attempt to preserve what time had tried to erase. He examined the faded ink with care. Though he had drawn dozens of maps after this one, none had affected him as deeply. The idea that an entire city could vanish, leaving nothing behind but memory, had haunted him for years. It reminded him of the fragile nature of human effort, how quickly stone turned to dust, and how easily the past slipped from collective memory. His maps were, in a sense, an act of resistance against that forgetting. They allowed people to remember, even if only faintly, the shapes of places that no longer cast shadows. A soft draught from the window stirred the edges of the parchment, making the sheets rustle like whispering voices. For a moment, Elias imagined the lost city calling out from its ashes, asking to be remembered once more. He smoothed the pages with both hands, feeling the slight tremble in his fingers. He wondered how many people still lived who could recall even fragments of the place. Perhaps none. Perhaps the memories he had captured here were the last traces of its existence. He carefully compared these old maps with the new notes left behind by the sailor. The contrast was striking. The vanished city had been reconstructed solely from stories filled with pain and longing. The harbour city described that morning was vibrant, alive, full of smells and sounds. One place was a ghost, the other pulsed with motion. Yet both depended entirely on human memory, the same fragile vessel that had carried him through his entire career. He folded the old maps slowly, each movement deliberate. The parchment resisted slightly, as though reluctant to be hidden again. When he tied the bundle with the frayed string, he paused for a long moment, holding it in his hands. He viewed it not as a map, but as a relic of human experience, a testament to the idea that places lived as long as people remembered them. Once the bundle was returned to its corner, Elias remained seated, his gaze drifting across the room. His thoughts lingered on the lost city and the men who had entrusted its final shape to him. He felt a quiet responsibility, a recognition that his maps, though drawn from incomplete accounts, might be the last record of places erased by time. In the stillness of the room, he understood something profound. Cartography was not just the drawing of places, but the carrying of stories. And some stories, especially those born of loss, demanded to be held with extraordinary care. He turned back to his desk, newly aware of the weight of his work. The distant harbour he planned to draw today suddenly felt connected to that long-gone city, both dependent on the fragile thread of memory. And so, with the old maps safely tucked away, Elias prepared to give shape to another world, one that still existed, but that someday too might fade. The oil lamp on Elias's desk had burned low by afternoon, leaving a soft amber haze in the room that blended with the grey light from the window. Outside, the sky had thickened with clouds, casting the canal in muted tones that made the water appear like brushed metal. Inside the room, the atmosphere shifted from morning clarity to the gentle dimness of late day. This was the hour Elias reserved for the slow, meditative work that required more patience than precision. Evening light softened every edge in the room, and under that softened light, his maps seemed to breathe more easily. He set aside the old bundle of maps from the lost city and returned to his workspace. The new parchment lay untouched, its fibers waiting, its pale surface carrying the faint promise of distant shores. Before beginning, he lit a fresh candle and placed it beside the lamp, increasing the warm pool of illumination without piercing the room's softness. The two flames flickered in unison for a moment, before settling into a calm, steady glow. Shadows gathered in the corners, while the desk itself became a small island of focused light. This hour had always been Elias's favorite. It held a kind of stillness that the morning did not possess, a tired quiet shaped by the long exhale of the day. In this muted silence, every sound became more intimate. The scratch of the quill, when it came, would seem louder. The turning of paper would carry a deeper rustle. Even the faint tapping of rain on the window, should it begin, would feel like a conversation rather than background noise. Elias adjusted his chair and pulled the parchment closer. He took his quill between his fingers, feeling the familiar weight of it settle into the groove his hand had formed over decades. The nib had been trimmed recently, and its thin metallic edge caught the candlelight with a delicate sheen. Before touching it to the ink, he paused, closing his eyes for a brief moment. This pause was part of his routine, an intentional slowing that allowed his thoughts to settle and align with the calm of the room. He exhaled slowly, letting go of lingering tension gathered from the earlier hours. Only then did he lower the quill into the inkwell. The ink clung to the nib in a small, smooth bead, dark and reflective. Elias lifted the quill and tapped it gently on the inkwell's rim, watching the excess ink fall back into the bottle with a quiet drop. The sound echoed faintly, absorbed by the stillness around him. He brought the quill to the parchment and hovered over the empty surface without yet making a mark. The first lines of a map required a state of mind he considered both delicate and intentional. He did not begin with the outline of the coast or the main shape of the harbour. Instead, he began with what he called the guiding lines. These lines were not literal features of the city. They were soft strokes, barely visible, that helped him sense the proportions, the balance, the rhythm of the place he was about to recreate. He drew them lightly, enough for him to see but faint enough to be erased or layered over later. These early strokes reminded him of the quiet preparation a musician performs before beginning a piece, checking the harmony, the flow, ensuring the composition would unfold naturally. As the quill moved across the parchment, the room filled with the gentle scratch of ink meeting fibre. The sound was steady and soothing. The candlelight flickered slightly, casting faint shadows that wavered across the map as it took shape. Elias leaned closer, adjusting the pressure of his strokes so that some lines appeared thin and hesitant, while others curved with quiet confidence. He paused occasionally to let the ink dry. During these pauses, he observed the lines without judgment, taking in their form, understanding how the emerging structure might guide the map's next element. His gaze moved slowly, absorbing every angle and subtle curve. He often believed that if he studied the blank spaces long enough, the next lines would reveal themselves without force. Once the guiding framework was set, Elias began shaping the recognizable features of the harbour described by the sailor earlier that morning. He focused first on the limestone quay. The sailor's memory of its brightness, the way it caught the sunlight even at dawn, influenced the thickness and angle of Elias's strokes. He drew the quay with a slight upward tilt, as though acknowledging the elevation described in the sailor's tone. Each stroke was deliberate, creating the sense of a solid structure meeting the shifting waves of the harbour. Behind the quay, he marked the placement of the fish market, a cluster of narrow stalls, implied not through detailed illustration, but through the density of short, repetitive marks. His maps were never literal portraits. Instead, they were impressions shaped by emotion and rhythm. The market became a pattern of carefully spaced lines that suggested movement, noise, and human presence without showing a single figure. He then shaped the twisting alleyways behind the harbour. These lines he drew with particular care, letting his hand follow the natural curve of his imagination while staying anchored to the fragments of memory the sailor had offered. The alleys curved inward and outward, folding upon one another like tangled thread. They carried the weight of the sailor's comparison, streets that twisted like rope left in the rain. Elias let that comparison guide his strokes, creating paths that felt organic, lived in, touched by years of footsteps. Occasionally, he paused to clean the nib of his quill, dragging it gently across the cloth that rested beside the inkwell. The cloth bore years of such strokes, its surface a mosaic of ink patterns in shades of grey and blue. This ritual cleaning allowed him to reset his pace, to maintain the clarity of his lines, and to remain fully present in the moment. As the map grew, he leaned closer to add finer details, small strokes indicating the approximate position of warehouses, faint markings representing the slight slope of the shoreline. He avoided adding unnecessary embellishment. Every mark needed to serve a purpose. He believed that maps, like memories, became more truthful when they were not overloaded with detail. The warm glow of the lamp shifted slowly across the parchment as the day outside dimmed further. Shadows lengthened across the room, merging with the corners until the space felt enclosed and protected. Elias felt the deep comfort of these hours, when daylight faded and uncertain shapes emerged in the half-light. The evening offered him a space that felt almost suspended from time, a moment when the city outside no longer demanded his attention and the world within the parchment became his only focus. As he continued his work, the sounds of the canal quieted. A boat passed more slowly, its oars dipping into the water with soft, rhythmic splashes. A distant door closed with a muted thud. The city seemed to fold into itself as the hour deepened into evening. Elias placed the quill down and examined the map so far. The lines felt alive under the candlelight, illuminated from above and softened by the shadow of his hand. The harbour was beginning to take shape, not just as a geographical location, but as a place with breath, texture, and memory. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but a calm sense of participation in something larger than himself. Night approached gently, and with it a deeper stillness. Elias understood that the map was far from finished, that many hours lay ahead. Yet in this moment, surrounded by warm light and soft shadows, the world he had begun to shape felt tangible, connected to the countless places he had imagined before. He let his gaze linger on the map for a long moment. Then, with the evening settling fully around him, he dipped his quill once more, ready to continue drawing the city that lived only through stories. The work had settled into a steady rhythm when Elias reached for one of the folded notes the sailor had brought. It was a thin piece of paper, torn hastily from a larger sheet, its edges rough and its surface marked by smudges of charcoal. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, the letters shaped by a moving ship's deck rather than a sturdy table. At first glance, the note seemed no different from the dozens he had received over the years. A list of half-remembered street names, vague distances, and fragmented impressions. But as Elias read through it again, he noticed a set of markings unlike the others. They appeared to describe a section of the city that lay beyond the harbour, a place few sailors bothered to mention. A district known only through passing references, tucked behind a cluster of older buildings. He placed the note beside the emerging map and studied it with quiet curiosity. The sailor had described this district not through direct detail, but through small, incidental observations. Sounds echoing down an alley, the angle of shadows at midday, the faint scent of spices drifting from unseen stalls. The descriptions were secondary, almost accidental, yet they revealed the subtle life of the city. Elias had learned long ago that such fragments were often the most truthful. Places people spoke of without intention often carried their most authentic character. He leaned closer to the parchment and examined the blank space behind the harbour area. The guiding lines he had drawn earlier left an open region waiting to be shaped. Instead of beginning with a clear outline, he allowed the notes to guide his imagination. He considered the description of a narrow passage that dipped into partial darkness during midday, suggesting tall buildings pressed tightly together. He imagined how the sunlight might barely reach the ground there, how the air might cool even in summer, how the distant sound of merchants might echo faintly into the enclosed corridors. With slow, measured strokes, Elias began suggesting the presence of this hidden district. He added a line here, a faint mark there, small hints of alleys curling back upon themselves, forming a quiet labyrinth behind the busier marketplace. He avoided making the lines too straight or orderly. Human settlements rarely grew with precision. They expanded through habits, needs, and the unpredictable flow of daily life. The district began to take on a shape formed by intuition rather than strict description, shaped by the small accidental details the sailor had offered. While working, Elias recalled the part of the note describing a peculiar sound that lingered near one of the streets, a rhythmic tapping, like wood striking stone at regular intervals. The sailor had not explained its origin. Perhaps it was a craftsman at work, or a merchant securing his stalls, or simply the uneven gait of someone using a walking stick. Whatever the source, the sound hinted at a place where daily routines unfolded slowly, where familiarity shaped the rhythm of the day. Elias suggested this atmosphere on the map, with a small cluster of short, angled lines indicating a series of closely packed workshops. Another fragment in the note spoke of an aroma carried by the wind, something warm, sweet, and slightly smoky. The sailor had mentioned it only briefly, but Elias recognized the importance of such a detail. Smells often revealed the nature of a street more clearly than its dimensions. He imagined a bakery hidden among the narrow paths, perhaps older and less grand than the bustling shops along the harbour. Its existence could be suggested with a small square placed near a joining of alleys, a subtle mark denoting a building that radiated warmth outward into the cold streets. He continued piecing together these sensory fragments. The note mentioned a sloping walkway leading toward a courtyard where the echoes of voices seemed to linger longer than usual, as if the space were enclosed by tall structures. Elias marked the presence of this courtyard with a slightly darker stroke, then connected it with two gently curved passages leading outward. He considered the emotional tone conveyed by the sailor's words. There had been a note of fatigue, but also a sense of unexpected comfort. Perhaps the sailor had rested there briefly, sheltered from the noise of the port. Elias let that sense influence the structure, giving the courtyard a shape that felt contained, protective. A final line in the note described a modest inn, painted a faded shade of blue, where sailors occasionally stayed when their ships were delayed. Only a few words were used to portray it, and the handwriting grew shaky near the end, as if written during a moment of exhaustion. Elias pictured the building as small, humble, worn by weather, yet carrying a sense of resilience. On the map, he indicated its presence with a soft rectangular outline, positioned along the edge of one of the wider streets that connected the harbour to the deeper parts of the city. As he stepped back to observe his work, Elias realized how natural the district felt within the map. It grew organically from the fragments provided by the sailor, forming a subtle extension of the harbour. No single detail had defined it. Rather, it emerged from the accumulation of small impressions, sounds, scents, textures of light and shadow. In this way, the city became more than a collection of buildings. It became a living place, shaped by human presence. The map now carried the beginnings of an inner life. The harbour might have been the initial focus, but this hidden district revealed the pulse of everyday existence. Elias sensed that the people who moved through those narrow alleys lived quieter, slower lives than those who worked the docks. Their streets might not be filled with activity or noise, but they likely held stories shaped by routine, memory, and the gentle rhythm of unremarkable days. He felt a shift in the atmosphere of the room as he studied the emerging lines. The faint glow of the candle cast a soft illumination across the parchment, making some strokes appear deeper while others faded toward invisibility. It gave the impression that the city was breathing, its brighter spaces vibrant, and its shadowed corners muted, like a place seen at dusk. Elias found the effect calming. It reminded him that cities lived in layers, with some aspects seen clearly and others only sensed. He placed the note aside and let his fingers rest on the edge of the parchment. The map was far from complete, yet it had reached a stage where the city no longer felt distant. It now lived partially within the quiet of the room, between the lamp's glow and the soft scrape of the quill. Through the fragments left by a passing traveller, a hidden district had emerged, one shaped not by grand structures, but by the quiet details that made it human. Elias felt the gentle certainty that he was beginning to understand this place, even though he would never set foot on its streets. The soft weight of the afternoon slowly shifted toward early evening, and as Elias continued his work, faint footsteps echoed on the stairs below. They were slow, deliberate steps, familiar in their rhythm. Without needing to see the visitor, he understood who it was. The bookbinder who owned the shop beneath his room often came up at this hour, usually carrying some errand as a pretext, but more often seeking a moment of quiet company. The man was older than Elias by a few years, with careful hands and a voice worn smooth from decades spent murmuring to himself over leather bindings and brittle pages. His presence always entered the room the same way, quietly, without urgency, as though he wished not to disturb the fragile stillness that lived there. When the bookbinder stepped inside, he brought with him the scent of glue, pressed paper, and aged leather. His clothes carried traces of dust from old volumes, and his fingertips were smudged with ink. He placed a small bundle of unfinished covers on a nearby shelf, not because Elias needed them, but because the act gave him a reason to linger. The two men shared a long history of these silent exchanges. They rarely spoke of anything significant, and yet their conversations often left a lingering sense of companionship, the kind that grew from shared habits rather than shared words. The bookbinder settled onto the stool by the window, adjusting it with a small scrape of wood against the floor. The canal outside reflected the dimming sky, and from there he watched the passing boats with the patience of someone accustomed to slow work. Elias remained at his desk, continuing to refine the lines of the harbour district, but he shifted slightly, acknowledging the man's presence without needing to interrupt his focus. Their interaction required no formality. After a quiet moment, the bookbinder glanced at the emerging map on the desk. He was not a cartographer, but his life spent repairing books had given him a familiarity with the structure of pages, the weight of ink, and the meaning woven into careful strokes. He observed the developing shapes with a discerning eye, following the patterns of the lines, the flow of the alleys, the rhythm of the coastline. Though he did not ask questions, his attention conveyed a gentle curiosity. Elias felt the subtle comfort of being watched by someone who understood craft. The bookbinder's presence never disrupted his concentration. Instead, it added a layer of calm to the room, as if the work became steadier in the company of another pair of hands that also lived by precision. Occasionally, the bookbinder would lean forward slightly, examining the finer details as Elias added them, the soft rustle of his coat audible in the quiet space. Their conversations always arrived gradually, formed not by questions, but by reflections. The bookbinder might comment on a pattern of lines that reminded him of something he had once seen in an old travel diary. Or he might recall a customer who had passed through the shop, carrying a book from one of the very ports Elias was depicting. These recollections often took the form of muted observations, small fragments of human stories, softened by time and retold without embellishment. They enriched the atmosphere of the room in the same way the sailor's notes had enriched the map. Elias listened while he worked, allowing the rhythm of the other man's words to settle into the background. The observations were simple, yet they carried a warmth that eased the heaviness of the day. The bookbinder, for his part, found quiet fascination in the way Elias shaped cities he had never seen. He occasionally mentioned how the maps reminded him of the bindings he crafted, structures created to hold stories safely within them. It was a comparison spoken without intent to flatter, but it lingered in Elias's mind each time he returned to his desk in the evenings. At one point, the bookbinder reached out and gently touched a rolled map on the shelf beside him. The parchment crinkled softly under his fingers. He remarked on its faded edges, noting how time changed paper just as it changed people. Elias felt a faint resonance in the remark. They both worked in professions bound to the preservation of fragile things. He with places, the bookbinder with words. Their crafts intersected in the way both depended on memory and the delicate persistence of detail. The conversation drifted into quieter reflections then. The bookbinder commented on the shifting weather, the gathering clouds, the coolness creeping into the air, the way light from the window had grown thin and silvered. Elias acknowledged these observations with small nods, his attention flickering between the map and the subtle presence beside him. The remarks themselves were unimportant, yet they formed a soft backdrop of shared attention, a moment of companionship within the isolation both men had chosen for their trades. The bookbinder eventually rose from the stool with the same steady slowness he had entered. He adjusted his coat and brushed a few flecks of paper dust from his sleeves. Before leaving, he cast one more look at the map, as though imprinting the image into his mind. There was a softness in his gaze, a quiet understanding of the work's significance, even if he could not articulate it. He inclined his head slightly in farewell, a gesture shaped more by habit than formality. When he descended the stairs, the room returned to its previous silence, though now touched by the faint echo of their shared moment. Elias felt the shift subtly. The presence of another had warmed the space, softened the solitude. It had offered a glimpse of human connection within the confines of his quiet world. He did not dwell on it, but the companionship settled into the atmosphere like an extra layer of light around the lamp. Elias returned fully to his map, the room once again belonging entirely to the scratch of quill, the scent of ink, and the delicate unfolding of distant places. Yet the earlier conversation lingered just enough to steady his thoughts. The city he was drawing felt slightly more alive, shaped not only by the sailor's memories, but also by the simple, grounding presence of the bookbinder who had paused in the fading light to witness its creation. In that brief intersection of two quiet lives, the map gained another layer of meaning, one formed not by the geography of the distant port, but by the shared silence of two craftsmen working in neighboring worlds. The daylight had faded into a muted glow by the time Elias leaned back from his work, allowing his eyes to rest. The harbour district, with its twisting alleys and pale stone quay, had begun to take on a shape of familiarity. Yet the more he studied the delicate network of lines, the more he felt a quiet awareness rising within him, an understanding that maps, no matter how carefully crafted, were shaped by the imperfections of human memory. This awareness often arrived during the quieter hours of the day, drifting into his thoughts with the same softness as dusk settling over the canals. He let his gaze wander across the room, not looking for anything in particular. The objects scattered about the space, old sketches, ink bottles, bound manuscripts, the seashell from the sailor, blurred into a textured backdrop. His hands remained still on the desk as a slowly forming realization moved through him. It occurred to him, as it often did, that the cities he drew were never purely representations of geography. Instead, they were mosaics of recollection, shaped by voices and silences, distortions and longings. Memory, fragile as it was, acted as a filter, colouring each feature with the emotions of the one who described it. He remembered the old storytellers who had spoken of the vanished city decades earlier. Their descriptions had been clouded with grief, and because of that grief, the city had taken on an almost dreamlike softness. Streets seemed wider in their recollections, or narrower when they spoke of loss. Buildings grew taller in memory when remembered with pride, or smaller when associated with fear. Even the sky seemed different depending on the emotion behind the remembrance. Elias had learned to translate these emotional distortions onto paper, allowing them to shape his lines in ways that felt honest, even if not technically precise. The harbour city before him now carried its own distortions. The sailor had spoken with a subtle weariness in his voice, one shaped by months at sea, so the streets in his recollections had curved with a kind of languid rhythm. His descriptions of the markets had been infused with a faint nostalgia, softening the noise into something gentler. Meanwhile, the limestone quay, described with admiration, gleamed brighter in Elias's imagination than it might in reality. These embellishments did not bother him. They formed the essence of place as it existed in human awareness, and he believed that such impressions often revealed more truth than strict measurements ever could. He thought about how memory stretched or shrank certain distances. A road travelled during a moment of exhaustion always felt longer in recollection, just as a joyful path seemed shorter. People remembered what mattered to them. A sailor might forget the exact angle of a street, but recall with perfect clarity the brightness of a door frame or the sound of a vendor singing in the morning. Such inconsistencies impressed Elias more than any surveyor's notes could. They reminded him that cities were alive, shaped by human experience rather than objective geometry. He reflected on how these emotional distortions found their way into every map he drew. The sweeping lines he added sometimes carried the remnants of someone's excitement or someone else's dread. A sudden break in a story, a pause or a hesitancy, became a shadow on the map, an unspoken hint of something significant. A detail repeated twice revealed the weight it held in the speaker's mind. Elias never ignored these cues. He let them guide his quill more than any formal methodology. His thoughts drifted back to the conversation with the bookbinder earlier. Although the man rarely travelled far beyond Amsterdam, his mind often wandered through the stories embedded in the books he restored. He once spoke of a passage he had found in an ancient journal, where a traveller described a city that felt simultaneously immense and claustrophobic, because he had visited it during a moment of personal turmoil. The bookbinder had suggested that the city itself might not have been contradictory, only the traveller's memory of it. That observation had stayed with Elias, because it affirmed something he had long believed. Maps were never neutral. They carried the emotional weight of the memories that fed them. He considered the sailors who came to him. Each carried his own emotional geography. Some described foreign ports with awe, others spoke of them with resentment, fear, or indifference. A coastline drawn by one man might appear smooth and inviting, while another might describe it as jagged and treacherous. A bustling marketplace could be remembered as chaotic noise by a tired sailor, or as vibrant life by one returning home. Elias had learned to study not only the details they offered, but also the spaces between those details, the hesitations, the repetition of certain words, the subtle tremors of the voice. These unspoken clues guided him almost more than the spoken ones. He could sense when a traveller struggled to describe a place he wished he had appreciated more. He could feel when a landmark carried a personal significance, perhaps tied to a moment of rest, fear, or longing. He sometimes wondered how many versions of a single city existed in the world, crafted by all the people who had ever walked its streets. If each memory formed its own map, then perhaps a city was less a physical location and more a collection of private geographies layered on top of one another. The thought prompted Elias to glance again at his map. He noticed how some lines curved slightly more than necessary, shaped by the sailor's tired recollection of narrow alleys. Other areas seemed more open, influenced by the man's fascination with the harbour's brightness. Even the placement of the blue-painted inn carried the weight of the sailor's fondness for the place, an affection that Elias had sensed in the tone of his account. These details, while subtle, made the map feel human, alive with memory rather than mechanical precision. He lifted his quill and examined its tip. The faint residue of ink clung to the metal, darkening in the shifting candlelight. He considered the tools of his trade and how they served as intermediaries between the spoken world and the one he recreated on parchment. The quill captured the nuances of memory, its strokes bending under the pressure of emotion rather than strict measurement. He wondered whether other cartographers allowed such influence to shape their work, or if they tried to resist the pull of human recollection. He suspected many sought objectivity, believing that a map should be a faithful, unaltered reflection of terrain. Elias respected the discipline of precision, yet he felt that its pursuit often stripped a place of its soul. His eyes drifted once more to the old maps of the vanished city. They were imperfect, shaped as much by grief as by memory. Yet those maps held a truth that transcended geographical accuracy. The sorrow embedded in their faded lines had preserved something that no precise survey ever could. They carried the emotional weight of loss, a truth deeper than the literal layout of streets. He realized that this was the quality he sought in every map he drew, an emotional resonance that would allow someone to feel the essence of a place, even if they had never walked its alleys. He hoped that those who studied his maps long after he was gone would sense not only geography, but humanity, stories suspended in lines and curves. The room became still as evening deepened. The lamp's flame flickered once, then steadied itself. Elias remained seated, reflecting on how memory shaped the world he drew, and, in turn, how his drawings shaped the world others would come to imagine. It struck him that he worked not merely with ink, but with the lingering impressions of human lives. Every mark he made was a quiet testament to the way people remembered, misremembered, hoped, and mourned. As he leaned forward again to continue shaping the map, Elias carried with him the understanding that no place existed in a single form. Every city lived 1,000 lives through the minds of those who experienced it. His task was not to choose the one true version, but to honor the delicate intersection of them all. In the soft glow of the lamp, he dipped his quill once more into the ink, preparing to give form to a place shaped not only by geography, but by the fragile and beautiful distortions of memory. The rain began without warning, a faint patter against the window pane that slowly grew into a steady, rhythmic tapping. Elias paused, sensing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Rain always brought with it a kind of reflective hush, an invitation for thoughts to move inward, to drift into quieter territories of memory and intuition. The sound mingled with the gentle flicker of the lamp and the faint scent of warm wax, creating an environment that seemed suspended outside of ordinary time. It was during such moments that he often felt closest to the essence of his craft. He set his quill aside and watched the raindrops gather into thin streams that traced slow paths down the glass. The canal outside blurred into a silvery surface, its ripples softened by the dimming light. The outlines of the houses across the water appeared washed out, their reflections dissolving into shifting patterns. The rain seemed to erase the hard edges of the world, turning everything into something fluid, impressionistic, like a memory not yet fully formed. As the rainfall deepened, the room filled with its gentle cadence. Each drop became a kind of punctuation, marking the quiet space in which his thoughts moved. Elias leaned back slightly and looked down at the map before him. The city he had been shaping all day now rested beneath the glow of the lamp, its alleys curved delicately, its harbour outlined with careful precision. Yet the rain made him see it differently. It softened the completed lines and made the unfinished spaces appear more mysterious, as if the city were hiding parts of itself until the right moment. He considered how many cities had vanished throughout history, some from disaster, as with the one he had mapped years ago, others simply swallowed by time, their stories left behind only in scattered recollections. He imagined the harbour city under rain. He pictured water gathering in the dips of its alleys, dripping from the edges of rooftops, running down the limestone quay in thin, shining streaks. He imagined the marketplace closing early, vendors covering their stalls with worn cloths to protect their goods. In his mind, the twisting alleys absorbed the rain like deep breaths, their stones darkening, their sounds muted. He lifted the shell again, the one the sailor had brought, and turned it in his fingers. The shell's surface glimmered faintly in the candlelight, the pink stripe reflecting a soft warmth. It seemed a small fragment of weather from another world, one shaped by the tides rather than the rain outside his window. He imagined a storm on the distant shoreline where the shell had originated, waves crashing against rocks, wind sweeping across the sand, rain falling with a different rhythm, wild, unrestrained. The thought filled him with a strange blend of longing and acceptance. He would never stand on that shore, yet here he was, holding a piece of it as the rain painted its own quiet landscape across his window. He returned the shell gently to the desk and studied the notes left by the sailor. Water had smudged some of the charcoal markings, blurring the edges of the sketch. The rain outside seemed to echo this blurring, erasing sharpness and leaving suggestion in its place. It reminded him that no memory remained crisp forever. Over time, recollections softened, lines brightened or faded depending on emotion. The rain made him acutely aware of the delicate balance between what could be remembered and what was inevitably lost. His thoughts drifted to the stories of the vanished city once more. Those old men who had sat in his room decades earlier had spoken with a quiet resignation when they described the night of the fire. Their memories had been shaped not only by what they lost, but by the way they lost it. Rain, he realized, could be both a blessing and a sorrow, capable of extinguishing flames or burying the remnants of what once stood. It blurred landscapes, smoothed out edges, allowed new shapes to emerge in the mind. He wondered whether their memories, softened by age, had resembled the rain-washed shapes he now saw through his window. The raindrops thickened, making a muted drumming sound that filled the room's empty spaces. Elias allowed the noise to seep into his thoughts. Rain had always been a companion to his work. It gave the world a slower rhythm, aligning it with the pace of his craft. It made the city outside feel smaller, more intimate, as though the distance between his room and the imagined places on his parchment had momentarily shortened. He turned back to the map and studied the unfinished areas. The rain encouraged a gentler touch. He felt less inclined to force clarity onto uncertain spaces. Instead, he allowed the wet, softened patterns outside the window to guide him. Some lines, he realized, did not need to be fully defined. Some streets could remain slightly elusive, their exact paths hinted at rather than declared. It mirrored how people remembered places, never perfectly, but with enough clarity to form a living sense of them. The harbour's limestone quay appeared differently in his mind now. He imagined how rain would alter its colour, darkening the stone, making the surface slick and reflective. He pictured sailors pulling tarps over their goods, boats rocking gently in the rising wind. Market stalls, usually lively, would be quiet. The narrow alleys behind the harbour, filled with twisting passages, would amplify the sound of dripping water. The hidden courtyard described in the sailor's notes would gather puddles, turning them into tiny mirrors reflecting the faint glow of lanterns. Rain, he thought, revealed a side of a city that sunlight never could. It laid bare the fragility of architecture, the wear of footsteps, the patterns of time. It also pulled people inward, into homes, inns, workshops, into the spaces where stories lingered in the quiet. Perhaps this was why he found the sound so comforting. It reminded him of how human lives folded into themselves during storms, drawing closer to warmth, memory, and reflection. He touched the map lightly, letting his fingers rest on the faint outline of the inner district. The quietness surrounding the labyrinth of alleys seemed even deeper now that rain filled the imagined streets. He felt an odd sense of connection to this distant place, a place he would never see but could now picture more vividly in weather he had personally known. The map seemed to absorb the rain's rhythm, its lines breathing with the sound. The room had transformed into a cocoon of warm light, parchment, and muted water. Elias found himself slowing, not from fatigue, but from the peaceful recognition that the city on the page was beginning to feel whole. He picked up the quill once more, dipped it gently into the ink, and continued shaping the world before him, letting the steady pulse of rain guide the next lines. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the early evening, and by the time it finally began to soften, Elias felt the shift in the room as distinctly as the change of light. The downpour faded into a delicate drizzle, and the slow tapping on the window turned into an irregular whisper. With the easing of the storm, the atmosphere in the room grew even quieter, as though the world outside were exhaling after holding its breath. This was the hour when he often felt most in tune with his work, when the day settled into stillness, and the boundary between his imagined cities and the real one outside seemed to dissolve. He adjusted the map slightly, drawing the parchment closer to the lamp where the glow remained steady and warm. The rain had darkened the sky so thoroughly that the room felt like it had slipped into evening, long before its time. Elias welcomed this dimness. It wrapped around him like a soft cloak, muffling distractions and sharpening the intimacy of his craft. The harbour city, half finished, stretched across the parchment. The familiar curves of the coastline, the emerging clusters of buildings, and the narrow passages all felt suspended in a moment of becoming. Neither complete nor unfinished, simply alive in their in-between state. He dipped his quill into the ink and began working on the key once more, but with a slower rhythm than earlier in the day. The rain had given him a new sense of the place, a different texture for its atmosphere. He envisioned the pale stone darkened by moisture and began shading certain areas with faint cross-hatching, suggesting the subtle unevenness of wet stone. These strokes were light and deliberate, creating an impression of rainwater settling into crevices, adding weight to the structure without overwhelming it. The gentle patter outside began to reflect the changing mood of the harbour. Elias imagined the stone archway the sailor had mentioned, standing firm against the softened twilight. He added it with a careful, angular stroke, simple, understated. As he worked, he paid attention not to precision, but to the feeling of the structure as it would appear on a rainy evening. Edges blurred, shadows softened, the whole shape wrapped in a quiet stillness. He lightly darkened the underside of the arch to convey the faint dampness that gathered there, giving the impression of water sheltering beneath its curve. Next, he returned to the market district. During the storm, this part of the city had seemed vivid in his mind, its stalls hurriedly closed, its merchants taking brief shelter. Now, in the lingering drizzle, he pictured them emerging again, shifting tarps, checking for leaks, preparing for the evening's trade should the weather clear. He did not draw people. His maps rarely included them, but he suggested their presence with small marks indicating the arrangement of stalls, the angles of awnings, and the subtle thickenings of lines showing areas of movement and rest. Human presence could be drawn without figures. It lived in the shapes and shadows of places where footsteps once gathered. Behind the market, a network of alleys curved inward, forming the hidden district he had shaped from the sailor's fragmented notes. Elias studied these lines with renewed focus, letting the rain's gentle rhythm influence the curvature of each passage. Some alleys, he imagined, would channel rainwater into narrow streams that flowed slowly toward gutters. Others, deeper and more enclosed, would trap puddles that reflected brief flashes of lamplight. He added faint, wavering lines to indicate the uneven ground, letting the quill glide lightly to create a sense of irregularity that felt true to such old, winding paths. As he shaded a small courtyard, one the sailor had mentioned almost in passing, he imagined how it might look under a damp evening sky. Courtyards often held the quietest echoes after rain. They became miniature basins of sound, catching drips from overhanging rooftops and amplifying them softly. He darkened the edges slightly to give a sense of enclosure, leaving the center lighter to suggest the presence of water pooling on the stone. The courtyard became a subtle focal point, a resting space within the map's intricate movement. Elias paused and leaned back, letting the map settle beneath his gaze. Rain had its own way of shaping cities, revealing things that sunlight hid. It softened the hardness of stone, deepened shadows, and quieted noise. It also altered the way people moved, how they sought shelter, how they gathered, how they shifted their routines. He reflected on how these shifts were seldom recorded in formal maps. Most cartographers drew cities as static places, fixed in their permanent form. But Elias preferred to capture the moods that weather etched into their surfaces. A city in sunlight was not the same as a city in rain, and each state carried its own truth. He placed his hand gently on the edge of the parchment, feeling the faint vibration of droplets against the window pane. Though he seldom stepped outside during storms, he felt a deep affinity for the way rain transformed the world. It created a kind of temporary simplicity, a cleansing of sound, a softening of light, an erasure of unnecessary detail. This mirrored the way he worked, distilling stories into lines, preserving only what lingered in memory. The drizzle outside gradually thinned, and a softer quiet took its place. Elias sensed the transition instinctively. The air cleared, the scent of wet stone drifting lightly into the room. He imagined the harbour city undergoing the same shift, the rain easing, the streets glistening, the first lanterns flickering to life as dusk approached. He added a few more shading strokes near the quay, darkening the base of the stone structures to suggest the lingering traces of moisture. These subtle decisions brought depth to the scene, grounding its imagined existence in the experience of real weather. He continued working in the slow, reflective movement that had come to define his evenings. Every stroke of the quill felt measured, shaped by the softened atmosphere. The rain did not dictate what he drew, but it guided the tone of his work, infusing the map with a quiet melancholy. The sound of occasional drips outside became the rhythm of his task, steady and unhurried. By the time he lifted his quill again, the map had acquired a new sense of presence, one shaped not only by the sailor's memories or his own imagination, but also by the simple influence of a rainy day. The harbour city appeared more settled, more lived in, as though the rain had washed it into fuller being. Elias rested his hands in his lap for a moment, absorbing the stillness. The drizzle outside faded entirely. The room fell into a silence that felt both intimate and expansive, holding within it the lingering echo of rain and the slow heartbeat of a distant place taking form in ink. By the time the last trace of drizzle evaporated into the cooling evening air, the city outside had grown still enough that even the faintest sound carried with clarity. Elias remained at his desk, his quill resting on the cloth, his hands motionless as he allowed the room's hush to settle fully around him. The map before him felt close to complete in its outlines, but the sense of the harbour city, its life, its pulse, had not yet fully revealed itself. That revelation often came during the late hours, when the world quieted enough for subtler thoughts to rise. It was then, when silence stretched comfortably between breaths, that Elias found space for the quiet reflection that shaped the heart of his work. He leaned back in his chair, letting the wood support the small ache in his spine. The lamp cast a warm glow across the parchment, illuminating the layered lines with a gentle amber softness. The shadows it created stretched long and fluid across the desk, merging with the deeper darkness gathered near the walls. In this dim glow, the map seemed almost to drift, its lines taking on a muted shimmer as though reflecting a distant light. He allowed his eyes to rest on the slow curves of the alleys and the broader strokes of the shoreline, absorbing the emerging sense of place that lingered between the ink. It was in these reflective moments that Elias often found himself contemplating a truth that lived at the core of his craft. He thought about the people who moved through the cities he drew, individuals whose steps he would never hear, whose lives he would never witness firsthand. The sailors' recollections had carried the echoes of these lives, voices calling across markets, the shuffle of feet across docks, the whispered negotiations of merchants, the laughter of children darting through alleys. These sounds, though described only briefly, lingered like faint currents beneath the surface of his imagination. He considered how each line on the map represented not just geography, but human presence. Streets existed because people walked them. Markets thrived because people gathered and bartered. Courtyards became important because someone had paused there, even briefly, leaving behind a trace of their existence. Yet no map could ever capture the fullness of those lives. A line could show where a street ran, but not the stories of those who had travelled it. A mark could indicate a marketplace, but not the fatigue, anticipation, or joy carried by those who visited it. This realization stirred a quiet melancholy in him. Maps, he understood, were always incomplete. They held the shape of a place, but never its soul. They captured structure, not breath. The most meaningful details of a city, the way a vendor arranged fruit on a stall, the way a mother soothed her child while crossing a noisy square, the way a man paused at a doorway to catch the last warmth of the sun, could never be drawn. These moments lived only in the minds of those who experienced them, dissolving as quickly as they appeared. He recalled the old men who had once described their vanished city, how their stories had been woven through with emotion. They had not told him merely where the streets ran. They had spoken of the memories those streets carried. One had recalled a particular turn in the road where he had met a friend each morning, while another described a window where his mother had stood in the evening light. These memories had shaped the map Elias created, even though they had nothing to do with geography as scholars defined it. He had captured them, not through literal representation, but through subtle decisions. A softened corner, a slightly widened square, a faint line added to indicate a place where life once paused. This consideration brought him to a deeper understanding of the harbour city before him. The sailors' memories, though scattered, held within them a glimpse of human experience. The smell of roasted spices suggested warmth and comfort. The brightness of the limestone quay hinted at familiarity and routine. The twisting alleys evoked the unpredictability of daily life in an old district. Elias realized that the most important task of his work at this moment was not to complete the map with technical precision, but to allow these quiet human impressions to guide the final shaping of the city. He let his thoughts drift to the lives behind the ink. The fishmongers preparing their stalls before dawn, the children weaving through alleyways in playful escape, the weary sailors resting in the courtyard after long journeys. He imagined the small rituals that defined their days: lighting a lantern, sweeping a doorstep, drawing water from the well, closing shutters against the wind. These rituals, though unseen by him, existed as surely as the buildings he sketched. Perhaps the true essence of the city lay not in its structure, but in these motions, small, repeated, human gestures that mapped out invisible geographies more intimate than any drawn on paper. The room around him grew profoundly silent. The canal outside reflected the dim light of the sky, and beyond his window, the city seemed wrapped in an evening calm that felt almost like a sigh. Elias's thoughts deepened with the stillness. He reflected on the maps he had drawn throughout his life, realizing that each one held traces of these same reflections. They carried his quiet attempts to honor the emotional landscapes of cities built by hands he would never shake, and walked by feet he would never follow. He knew that some would see his maps only as tools, guides for travel, references for trade. Yet he hoped, quietly and without ambition, that a few might sense the deeper intention behind his lines. Perhaps someone would linger over the curve of a street and wonder what story had shaped its placement. Perhaps someone would see the slight widening of a square and feel that something important once happened there. Even if they never knew the precise memory that informed these details, he wished that the presence of human life could still be felt. The map on his desk, incomplete yet deeply alive, seemed to breathe with these thoughts. Each alley and shoreline carried within it echoes of unspoken stories. Elias felt his purpose settle gently within him, not to capture a place as it truly was, but to offer a quiet tribute to the countless lives that had shaped it. He reached for his quill again, not to add more detail, but to rest it lightly on the paper, acknowledging the delicate line between observation and imagination. In this moment, the map and his thoughts existed in a shared silence, a stillness that honored both the world outside his window and the distant world he was shaping in ink. The understanding that every map held layers of untold stories settled softly in his chest, as steady as his own breath. The evening deepened into a muted blue, and for a long moment Elias remained motionless, allowing his eyes to drift between the map on the desk and the faint reflections trembling across the canal outside his window. A hush had settled over Amsterdam that felt almost fragile in its stillness. Lanterns glowed softly along the street, their flickering halos trembling in the damp air. It was during this hour, between day and night, between work and rest, that he often found himself drawn to quiet observation. The world beyond the glass took on a gentler shape, and he felt compelled to witness it, as though it were another map unfolding before him. He rose from his chair slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back, and stepped toward the window. The floorboards groaned softly beneath him, acknowledging his movement with familiar complaint. He placed his hand against the cool wooden frame and leaned slightly forward, letting the faint breeze touch his face. The canal below reflected the dimming sky with a subdued shimmer, as though the entire surface were holding the remnants of daylight in its grasp. Ripples spread outward from a passing boat, each wave distorting the lantern reflections into trembling patterns. A small vessel drifted along the water, its oars dipped gently into the surface with a slow, measured rhythm. The oarsman's silhouette leaned forward and back in a quiet repetition, his motion mirrored in the water. The soft splash of the oars sounded through the stillness, steady and unhurried. The light from his lantern cast a faint glow along the ripples, making the surrounding darkness appear softer, as though held at bay by a thin, resilient thread of warmth. Further down the canal, a few windows flickered to life behind rippled glass. In one, the shadow of a woman moved about her kitchen, her gestures calm and unhurried. In another, a man leaned over a table, absorbed in his own late-hour work. Their quiet routines blended into the broader silence, forming an unspoken harmony that filled the street. Elias watched their movements with a sense of intimacy, not intrusion, but recognition. He felt a kinship with these distant figures whose modest tasks shaped the rhythm of the evening, just as his own shaped the map on his desk. He allowed his gaze to travel upward where the sky, still damp from the earlier storm, held the first hints of night. Clouds moved slowly across the darkening expanse, thickened by moisture and softened by the fading light. A faint glow lingered behind them, sunset hues dissolving into deeper shades. The city's rooftops formed uneven silhouettes against the sky, some sharp, others softened by the mist. The chimneys, tall and narrow, exhaled thin trails of smoke that drifted lazily upward, mingling with the low clouds until they became indistinguishable. As he watched these shifting shapes, Elias became aware of the subtle balance between movement and stillness. The water moved, the clouds drifted, the lantern flames wavered, but the city itself rested, suspended in a rare moment of calm before night fully claimed it. He felt drawn to this balance, sensing that it mirrored the quiet transition within his own thoughts. The day's labor had left him thoughtful, contemplative, and the sight of the world easing into darkness filled him with a gentle melancholy. He found himself imagining how the distant harbour city would appear in this same hour. He pictured the stone quay darkened by rain, the sea reflecting the dimming sky in shades of blue and grey. He imagined lanterns swinging gently in the breeze, their light flickering over the wet stone and along the hulls of moored ships. He pictured narrow streets beginning to glow with scattered points of light as residents lit their lamps, their modest homes becoming islands of warmth within the cooling air. Even from afar, the harbour city felt connected to the quiet unfolding outside his window, as though both places belonged to the same rhythm of nightfall. His gaze shifted back to the boat passing beneath him. The oarsman slowed his pace as he approached a nearby bridge, guiding the vessel with practiced ease. Elias watched the water trail behind the boat, the ripples expanding outward until they touched the canal walls and dissolved against the stone. The sight carried a quiet symbolism he often felt during these reflective hours. How even the smallest movement could send out waves that extended beyond their origin. Memory worked the same way, he thought. A single recollection could radiate outward, shaping countless impressions. A place once visited left ripples in a person's mind, growing, widening, touching other memories in subtle ways. He leaned his forehead gently against the window's cool glass. The faint temperature difference between his skin and the pane brought him back from distant thoughts. The dim street below shifted slightly as a gust of wind moved through the narrow canal, disturbing the water's surface. Leaves skittered along the cobblestones, their brittle edges scraping softly. He studied the lantern reflections one last time before stepping back from the window. The world outside had settled into its nighttime stillness, the kind that deepened slowly and without fanfare. He felt a familiar quietness settle inside himself as well, a gentle weight that invited introspection rather than fatigue. Returning to his chair, he paused to look once more at the map. The harbour city's lines appeared softer under the lamplight, as though it too had fallen into its evening state. The alleys seemed to curve more quietly, the shoreline held its shape with a subdued dignity. The map no longer felt like an unfinished task, but like a companion to the night outside, another quiet landscape illuminated by the faint glow of a flame. In that moment, surrounded by the stillness of the street and the soft radiance of the lamp, Elias felt the serene alignment of two worlds, the one outside his window and the one slowly forming beneath his hand. Both existed in silence. Both carried echoes of countless lives, and both, in their own way, belonged to him in this hour suspended between light and darkness. The quiet of the evening deepened into something heavier, a stillness that seemed to settle over every object in the room. Elias remained seated for a while longer, watching the lamplight tremble slightly as the flame adjusted to the faint draughts drifting through the window. The map before him had taken on the muted warmth of the candle's glow, its lines softening into a gentle blur at the edges. He felt the familiar pull of weariness, not the kind that demanded rest, but the kind that nudged him toward reflection. It was during these hours, when the city had nearly fallen asleep, that he often allowed himself to wander through thoughts he pushed aside during the day. He turned slightly in his chair, letting his gaze drift across the shelves lining the wall. Rolled maps rested in uneven stacks. Some were tied neatly with ribbon, others sagged under their own age, their edges curled from years of handling. Each one held fragments of distant places shaped through the memories of travellers who had long since moved on. He saw maps of harbours, desert outposts, mountain passes, and cities built along riverbanks. He saw small villages drawn from uncertain recollections, their streets assembled from the faintest details. They formed what felt like a quiet archive of human experience, stacked and forgotten in the dimness of his room. The sight reminded him of the years behind him, decades spent tracing the memories of others, piecing together landscapes from fragments of stories. He had given his life to this practice, almost without realizing it. One map had led to another, and another after that, until the routine became a rhythm he no longer questioned. He rarely thought about how much time had passed, or how much of his life had been shaped by the quiet presence of this room. Yet now, in the stillness of the evening, the understanding pressed on him with a gentle insistence. His world had narrowed into this space, these tools, these imagined cities. A faint ache stirred within him, not regret, not sorrow, but something quieter and harder to name. He wondered how long it had been since he had allowed himself to think of that younger version of himself, the one who had dreamed of seeing the world. As a boy, he had imagined standing on distant shores, feeling the wind of unfamiliar places. He had pictured mountains rising before him, cities unfolding like open books, oceans stretching endlessly toward unseen horizons. Yet somewhere along the way, the dream had shifted. He had chosen stillness instead of movement, observation instead of travel. The world had come to him through others' memories, and he had accepted that role so completely that he no longer knew whether the original dream had faded or simply evolved. He allowed his eyes to wander back to the window. The street outside had grown even darker, and the reflections in the canal had softened into long, wavering streaks of light. A faint mist rose from the water, creating a thin veil that blurred the far side of the canal. The air held a sense of moisture left behind by the earlier rain, and a coolness drifted slowly through the cracks in the window frame. It carried the scent of wet stone and distant chimney smoke, grounding him in the present, even as his thoughts wandered. He closed his eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he found himself imagining the distant city once more. Not the city on the map, but the city as it lived in the stories he had heard. He pictured the harbour at this same hour, illuminated by the fading glow of lanterns. He imagined the residents preparing for the night, sailors securing their ropes, families closing their shutters, merchants counting coins or smoothing cloth. He pictured the faint hum of voices drifting through narrow alleys as late visitors made their way home. These scenes felt vivid, alive, as though he was standing among them rather than sitting alone at his desk. Yet he recognized the illusion. The city existed only in his mind, shaped by fragments of recollection and his own quiet longing. He could picture it with clarity, but he would never walk its streets or feel the texture of its stones beneath his boots. He felt a familiar blend of acceptance and melancholy settle over him. He understood that his connection to the world was not formed through movement, but through imagination, through the stories others carried with them and the maps he shaped from those stories. He opened his eyes again and let them rest on the map. The ink had dried into a uniform softness, and the lines felt steadier now than they had earlier in the day. They seemed to capture not only the geographical shape of the harbour, but also the gentle rhythm of the lives that moved through it. He realized that, in his own way, he had lived inside these imagined places more deeply than many who had travelled widely. He had studied them with patience, listened to their echoes, allowed their impressions to settle into his quiet routines. In that sense, his world was vast, even if measured only in ink and memory. His thoughts drifted to the future, an uncommon direction for his mind. He considered the maps he would leave behind. Though he kept no apprentices and made no effort to preserve his work formally, he wondered whether anyone might someday unroll one of his parchments and feel the same quiet sense of presence he felt when drawing them. Perhaps someone would study his harbour city and imagine its residents, its shifting sounds, its weathered buildings. Perhaps someone would see the softened lines and understand that they marked more than geography. They marked the contours of human recollection. He lifted the lamp slightly and adjusted its position so the light fell more evenly across the desk. The flame brightened, revealing subtle textures in the parchment. He traced a faint line at the edge of the map with the tip of his finger. The sensation of paper beneath his skin grounded him in the moment. He understood that the work before him had become more than a task. It had grown into a form of quiet devotion, an attempt to preserve fleeting impressions before they faded completely. The thought brought him a sense of calm. He felt no urgency to complete the map quickly. Instead, he felt the steady, patient pull of his craft, guiding him through the final hours of the night. The world outside might change. Lanterns might dim, mist might thicken, footsteps might fade. But the map would remain, slowly taking shape beneath his hand. He rested his gaze on the city one more time. In the warm glow of the lamp, it looked almost alive. The curved alleys seemed to whisper of hidden stories. The gentle shading suggested the weight of rain still clinging to the stone. The harbour, though silent, seemed to hold an unspoken promise of distant journeys. Elias let the quiet fill him. The day had been long, the work demanding, but in this moment, surrounded by stillness, lamplight, and the slow breath of night, he felt aligned with the world he had spent decades learning to translate. The harbour city, though distant, had become part of his own quiet existence, just as countless others had before it. The understanding settled over him like a soft blanket. He had given his life to these imagined places, and through them he had come to know something essential about the world, not through footsteps, but through the quiet, persistent act of listening. He inhaled, slow and steady, and prepared himself for the final hours of work that awaited him. The night settled fully now, drawing its soft curtain across the city and across Elias's small room. The lamp on his desk glowed with a steady amber warmth, casting gentle halos across the parchment. Outside, the canal had grown almost perfectly still, its surface reflecting the dim lanterns like a sheet of glass. The world seemed to hold its breath in this hour, when even distant footsteps faded into nothing, and the city folded itself into silence. This was the hour when Elias always felt a subtle shift inside himself, a transition between the steady concentration of work and the quiet awareness that accompanied the end of a long day. He lifted the map slightly and angled it toward the light. The lines he had drawn throughout the day blended into a calm, cohesive whole. The harbour, the twisting alleys, the courtyard, the hidden inn, all of them rested on the parchment with a sense of completion, though he knew the map was not yet finished. There were details left to refine, subtle shadings left to add, thoughts still lingering around the edges of the imagined city. Yet something in the room's stillness suggested that the time for such work had passed for now. The evening had grown too deep, its quiet too tender to interrupt with further labour. Elias placed the map back on the desk with care, letting his fingers linger along the bottom edge. He felt the faint roughness of the paper beneath his fingertips, the slight curl formed where the parchment had soaked up the day's humidity. The tactile reminder grounded him in the present, even as his thoughts drifted softly toward the edges of introspection. He leaned back and allowed the chair to support his tired posture, feeling the familiar creak beneath him. He glanced around the room. Everything appeared softened by the lamplight. The shelves of rolled maps, the small wooden chest holding his tools, the ink bottles reflecting twin glimmers of flame. Even the floorboards seemed gentler in the warm glow. A faint scent of wet wood drifted in through the small crack beneath the window, carrying with it the remnants of the earlier rain. The air felt cool, but not uncomfortably so. Rather, it reminded him of evenings from his childhood, when he would sit by the fire with his father, listening to stories about faraway lands he never expected to see. His gaze returned to the map once more. He studied the lines again, but this time not as a craftsman shaping a city, but as an observer trying to understand the life the city carried. He imagined lanterns flickering along its streets, glimmers reflected on rain-soaked stone. He imagined the soft shuffle of footsteps as the residents settled into their nightly routines. A vendor closing the shutters of a stall, a sailor finishing his drink in the dim light of a tavern, a mother soothing a restless child. These imagined movements felt more vivid now than during the day, softened by the stillness of the hour. He thought again about his place within this quiet world. The life he lived, predictable, solitary, bound to routine, had shaped him into someone who understood the subtle movements of quiet hours more than the vibrant energy of daylight crowds. He knew the weight of lamplight better than the warmth of the sun on distant shores. He understood how stillness could make a room feel larger than it was, how the faintest sound could carry meaning, how the world could shrink to a small circle of light without feeling confining. These were the landscapes he navigated, the ones he knew intimately. He considered for a moment the paths his life had not taken. The traveller's life, the one he once imagined, would have brought him to distant harbours, bustling markets, windswept cliffs, and unfamiliar cities. He might have stood on ships that rocked beneath foreign constellations, or walked roads that stretched endlessly across unknown countries. Yet he had chosen, or perhaps drifted naturally into, a different life, one rooted in the quiet observation of others' journeys. Instead of experiencing the world through movement, he experienced it through memory, imagination, and the stories of those who passed through his door. This realization did not bring regret. Instead, it filled him with a calm understanding. Every life, he thought, carved its own shape. His had taken the form of these quiet nights, these steady hours spent in reflection, these cities drawn in ink and memory. He had lived not in miles travelled, but in worlds imagined, and in that way he had experienced landscapes countless travellers never paused to see. His thoughts drifted toward the intangible aspects of his craft, not the lines, nor the shading, nor the technical precision, but the quiet attention he offered to places he would never touch. He wondered whether the harbour city he had spent the day drawing would someday fade, as all cities eventually did. Perhaps it would be reshaped by time. Perhaps it would fall into disrepair. Perhaps it would vanish entirely. Yet, in his map, it would endure. Its alleys, its harbour, its quiet courtyards would remain preserved in the amber glow of his ink, fixed in the delicate stillness of a moment that would otherwise be lost. The thought brought a soft, almost imperceptible swell of emotion into his chest. Not pride, but a sense of gentle purpose. He did not draw maps merely to record geography. He drew them to hold on to something fleeting, something fragile. He preserved the unspoken details carried by those who had walked the streets, sailed the harbours, and lived the small, ephemeral moments that made up a life. He lifted the shell again, the one brought by the sailor, and held it near the lamp. The soft pink stripe glimmered in the warm light. He turned it slowly between his fingers, feeling the smooth surface against his skin. This shell, carried across the sea, seemed to hold within it both distance and intimacy. It reminded him that even the smallest objects carried the world inside them, if one knew how to look. Gently, he set the shell beside the map. The two objects, one shaped by nature, the other by ink, lay side by side like tokens of two interconnected worlds. The shell belonged to the distant shoreline he would never stand upon, while the map belonged to the world he shaped in this room. Yet together they formed a quiet bridge between imagination and reality, between longing and presence. He lowered his gaze and let his hand rest near the edge of the desk. The lamp flickered softly, casting a shifting glow across the parchment. The city he had drawn felt close now, not merely a creation, but a companion in the stillness of the hour. In this moment, surrounded by quiet, Elias understood with gentle clarity that the world he lived in was not defined by the distance he travelled, but by the depth with which he observed the places that came to him. He let that understanding settle into the evening, absorbing its warmth as the night continued to deepen around him. The hour grew late enough that the flame in the lamp began to waver, its small reservoir of oil thinning into a faint sheen. Elias noticed the subtle change in the light, the way the shadows lengthened and softened at the same time, spreading gently across the desk. This was the moment when the room seemed to acknowledge the end of the day, when even the tools of his craft suggested rest rather than continuation. He placed the quill down with deliberate care, letting it settle beside the ink bottle, its work complete for now. He looked once more at the map. The city lay quietly beneath the warm glow, its lines carrying the softness of night. It felt less like a drawing and more like a memory, something fragile, tender, and suspended gently in time. Elias traced the edge of the parchment with his fingertips, sensing the faint unevenness where the fibres had absorbed the day's work. It was a familiar gesture, one he always performed at the end of a long session, as though confirming the connection between his hands and the distant place they had shaped. He sat back, allowing his posture to relax for the first time in hours. The chair creaked in response, echoing through the stillness. He turned his gaze to the window, where the canal had become a long, dark mirror, reflecting the dim lanterns and the faint glow of a clouded moon. The reflections stretched and blurred with the slightest motion of the water, creating slow, fluid patterns that drifted toward the edges of the canal. The air outside held a coolness sharpened by the passing rain, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and extinguished hearths. He observed the empty street with a sense of quiet affection. The houses, their windows mostly dark, formed a gentle outline against the night sky. The soft hum of distant wind brushed along the canal, stirring the surface into faint ripples. Somewhere far off, a door closed with a muffled thud. These sounds, though small, felt like the final exhalations of the day, the world settling into its night-long rest. Elias let his thoughts drift. He reflected on the hours he had spent in this room, days shaped by the steady progress of ink and line, years stitched together by the gentle rhythm of quiet work. His life had unfolded in these long evenings, in the soft murmur of the canal, in the stories carried by those who knocked on his door. He had come to accept the slow, deliberate nature of his days, recognizing the quiet dignity in creating something that might outlast him. There was no need for grandeur or recognition. The act itself had always been enough. He rose from his chair and moved slowly around the room, extinguishing the smaller candles that had burned low. Each flame yielded with a soft hiss, releasing thin ribbons of smoke that curled upward before dissolving into the cool air. The room dimmed gradually, leaving only the lamp on the desk to cast its warm, steady glow. He placed his hand briefly on the back of the chair, feeling the faint warmth left by his body, then turned once more toward the map. The harbour city rested quietly beneath the lamp's remaining light. Its lines appeared softer now, merging gently with the shadows. It looked complete in the way something unfinished can feel whole, not because every detail had been drawn, but because the essence had taken shape. He sensed the quiet pulse of life within its alleys, the lingering echoes of footsteps and voices, the unspoken stories woven through its structure. The city seemed to inhabit the room with him, sharing the night's stillness. He reached forward and carefully slid a thin sheet of parchment over the map to protect it from dust. The gesture carried a sense of ritual, a closing of the day's work. Then he turned down the wick of the lamp. The flame dimmed to a soft, trembling glow before finally extinguishing, leaving a faint after-image flickering in his vision. In the darkness that followed, the room felt peaceful, neither empty nor lonely, but simply quiet in a way that matched the rhythm of his breath. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, and listened to the gentle hum of the night settling around him. The sounds of the canal, the distant rustle of wind, the faint shifting of the building's wooden beams, all blended into a soft, enveloping calm. He stepped away from the desk, moving slowly across the room, and prepared for rest. The day had been long, shaped by steady concentration and softer reflection. Yet the stillness he felt now held a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came not from completion, but from presence, being part of a world shaped by imagination, patience, and the delicate threads of other people's memories. As he lay down, the faint scent of ink and cooling wax lingered in the air. He closed his eyes, and the image of the harbour city drifted gently through his thoughts. Its rain-washed stone, its glimmering water, its curved alleys resting under lantern light. The city moved with him into the depths of night, settling softly in the quiet space between waking and sleep. In that final moment before rest claimed him, Elias felt a gentle contentment. The world he had shaped in ink would wait for him in the morning, patient and unhurried. The distant city, though imagined, seemed to breathe alongside him as the night wrapped itself around the small room. And in that quiet, he surrendered to sleep, letting the last threads of the day dissolve into silence.